just in terms of the agenda today, the topic today is effective business change just communication? What a question. I love these questions we pose to ourselves. I thank you for Toby and Giles for agreeing to do this one this month. Thank you for those who are returning to your second or third event of iCoTechs, and also welcome to those who have not attended an event before. So my name is Joel Markham. I'm the CEO and founder of iCoTech Services. Me and Giles run these sessions once a month where we just like to have a conversation and bring in a special guest. This week's special guest is Toby, who will move on to introduce you in a few minutes time. But just in terms of housekeeping, if you could make sure that you're on mute, that'd be great. It just allows the kind of lack of background noise to not distract the speaker. We do encourage questions and dialogue from the audience, so please feel free to put a question into the chat window, and we'll try our best to use the Microsoft technology stack to help us collaborate effectively and efficiently on this call. But yeah, the concept of the round table is really to bring us together to talk about our views. These views are our own, not the organizations that we work for. It's just an informal conversation to bring value to a community of people that want to learn more and to share their thoughts and opinions on these topics. And it's been quite well received so far. So me and Giles are really happy with the output. I really enjoyed just having a conversation and having a dialogue between us and others, of course. And yeah, so this is our seventh event. Can you believe that, Giles? Our seventh event, and we're carrying on with targeting one a month this year. So yeah, thank you very much. So if you've got any further questions, if you want to be a part of the conversation at some point in the future, please do feel free to email us at info@icotechservices.co.uk. We're also on all the social channels, so you can follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn. I think we're still on Spotify. We're on Spotify, still there. So you can follow us and listen to us in the car if you really want to on Spotify. But yeah, it's quite unbelievable to think we're on Spotify. But yes. So this week's topic is effective business change just communication? And I'll hand over to Toby, to introduce himself, and then we'll go on to Giles to intro, and then go on into the presentation which Giles has put together for us, and go from there. So Toby, do you want to introduce yourself and just give a quick summary of you and your background, and we'll move on to Giles then. Cheers.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you, Joel. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toby Lumber. I'm the head of PPM Delivery here at iCoTech. So I've been working at iCoTech for around about 3 months so far. My background is in all reams of project management. So both really from being involved directly myself as a practitioner, to working on the business side and working very much in terms of the business change elements, and also in the managerial side. So I've worked through various different domains, so utilities, construction, central government, IT. So lots of different areas. IT have always kind of, I guess, been my key domain, and that to some extent is why I'm here with iCoTech today. So that's me. I'm here to give my views on change management, and where I've seen it done well and done really badly as well. And hopefully we can all learn a few things today. Giles.
Hi, thanks, Toby. That was a great introduction. Great to have you here. For those who haven't been before, my name's Giles. I am Programme Director in the Cabinet Office. I run a large cross-government interoperability programme, and I'm also part of the Chief Technology Officer's Office for Government, looking at enterprise architecture, so defining the enterprise architecture and the future state for government. But here I'm in sort of the capacity similar to Toby and Joel, from our experiences, what we've done, and how we can help the community understand some of the problems that we've faced. So I'll jump straight into the presentation. There we go. So as you may have seen last time, start with a bit of a look at some quotes on change and communication. I suppose you go from a sort of revolutionary thinker, very old, Socrates, changes to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but building the new, all the way to Elon Musk. Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if all the alternative is disaster. And sort of probably my favorite, and I go back to Peter, Peter Drucker several times here. The businesses that does not innovate ages and declines, and in a period of rapid change such as the present, the decline will be fast. And sort of really clear advice from Peter there. I'm a big fan of Peter Drucker. If you haven't read any of his works, he's great. And I would really suggest having a look. So second slide is a bit about statistics behind some of the issues with communication and change. Both from Gartner this week. And I've used Gartner quite a bit. And from an IT perspective, they've got some excellent research. But it's quite startling to have a look at some of the statistics. And Joel and Toby, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on these. Is 73% of change-affected employees report experiencing moderate to high stress levels, and then suffer a 5% decline in performance because of that stress level. And that's a significant amount of lost productivity because of change. So on the right, we start looking at sort of some of the reasons behind that sort of those stress levels, those moderate to high stress levels. So change fatigue. I mean, as we know, changes are we're consistently changing. We have to iterate and change as we go through business, our lives. Every day we're doing a change and we're going through a change process. And I think it can be very fatiguing, especially if it isn't done very well and it's done to you and not with you, which we're going to discuss a bit further. Audience information overload, 45.6% of respondents said that this was an issue. And then finally, I think from my perspective, working in technology, the challenges of adapting to digital trends and new technologies, it's a really important part for me, focusing on how we deliver new technologies in government, especially a large cross-government program and the enterprise architectures. How do we deliver transformation and change and the use of new technologies across government and across an organization, because it can be across government or any organization? How do we do that effectively, and how do we bring people along on that journey rather than that journey being done to people? How can we bring them along on that journey? And I'll go into that a bit in a future slide. So I suppose from Toby and Joel, do you have any sort of experience of that challenge of adapting to digital trends, that stress that's created by change programs, by consistent change?
I'm on mute. I'm gonna have to work out a way of getting around that. There needs to be a big button in red saying you're on mute on the screen, doesn't it? Change management view. I'll put that into Microsoft. You'll see that in a few minutes' time. Not, but yeah, a big red button saying you're on mute. But yeah, it's interesting how your quotes. If you went back to your first slide, Giles, I think it was in Peter. I can't remember. Was that effectively change is continually happening, and everybody's talking about how you need a change in order to survive and not decline. And to avoid a disaster. And if we go back to the second slide, then it's everybody, or 73% of change affected employees report experiencing moderate to high stress levels. So change is happening. Change is not going to stop. For me, it's about how do we enable change to happen without causing stress levels and pain. And the fact of life is, we're always going to change, and arguably we could have another topic on the rate of change, exponential change, exponential growth, exponential challenges that we face across humanity. But we've got to get better at delivering and changing all the time.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And so as we go through this, we can Toby's going to give us some really good examples of how we could put a framework in place for change programs, but it's also about how do we effectively communicate through that change program. How do we effectively give people, reduce those stress levels, because change is going to be stressful regardless of what change it is. So how do we reduce that to a manageable level, or reduce it from at least 73% down to a lower level? So moving on to sort of
I think the thing that always astounds me around change is when you look at some of the statistics and the research around how successful change is, or more to the point, how unsuccessful number of change items are. Particularly when you look at some of the large change vehicles which take place. know particularly in central government, there's been lots of very large change programs, and some of those haven't been very successful. I'm sure definitely not in your area, but has been known in other areas. But this kind of highlights all the negative impacts that change has on the organisation, on the employees and the colleagues that work in there, and ultimately it's not producing the end benefits that it's intended. And time again, I think when you go back and you take those elements apart, you find it's because the change hasn't been managed correctly. And it does really emphasize just how important it is to get this right, because it has so many consequences if it's not done correctly.
Yeah, I totally agree about government not being the paragon of virtue when it comes to change management. And definitely it's about reducing the effect of change. I don't think we may get substantially better, but I think there's always going to be that friction, and it's how to reduce that friction to as manageable a level as possible. So yeah, it's a really good point there, Toby. And hopefully you can give us some of that inside knowledge on how to effectively manage it. So just on the next slide, so we sort of focus a bit on communication and sort of my take on communication. And I sort of had a look around and I was looking at some word clouds around communication on how what people see as what communication is, but also then my own interpretation of sort of what is good communication, what do you need, what sort of attributes and what sort of skills you need. So if there's anything in the word cloud that you either disagree with or something you think is missing, either chuck it in the chat or stick your hand up and join in the conversation if you feel the need. So something that I think when you discuss communication and people immediately, or when I've discussed it with people immediately assume it's how you deliver a message to someone. And I sort of wanted to change it around and also take a focus on the listening. So I think we focus on what do we need to send to people? How do we deliver a message? How do we deliver a vision? How do we deliver our plan? What I think is probably a better first step and something that I've taken sort of efforts to improve is my ability to listen, to be able to listen to people, how they feel, how people are going to be affected by the change, what their concerns are, and how to incorporate that through sort of good listening skills, how to incorporate and hear what message is coming across and understand their concerns. I think that's a really important thing to remember, rather than just going straight to how do I provide clear information to people, is actually understanding and listening to those people first that are either going to be engaged in the change process or those stakeholders that want to push that forwards. The second point I brought up is communication. And I think, well, actually, I'd like to deal with conversation and non-verbal communication both at the same time. Now, I was in the office this morning, second week back I've been in the office, and I think the change to a hybrid working environment and the impact of the pandemic on the way we interact and the way that we interact with our colleagues has really impacted the two points that I've raised. So conversation, forming the basis of those relationships, really understanding and having an opportunity to discuss something in person with someone. I really felt I benefited from that now that I've been back in the office. And again, linked to that is that non-verbal communication. So someone may say something, but actually the way they say something and the way they act, the way they hold themselves, the way they come across, the way they feel can be exhibited, and in part or largely through their non-verbal communication. So body position, facial expressions, hand movements, gestures, etc., etc. I think that's something that I have found that I have my skills in those two areas has somewhat been eroded by being in a sort of a more digital environment, and something that I've paid less attention to. I would probably say I'm not the most empathetic of all the time. I've got a military background. It's all sort of can be quite rigid in the military, the way things are. But I think those three, taking it from a different perspective, rather than focusing on what message am I communicating, it's actually how do I communicate at a human level with other people who are going to be involved in that change process. So I would welcome Toby, again, your thoughts, and Joel on those 3 points, or any other areas you think from a communication perspective that really helps you communicate well with either your employees, your colleagues, or those involved in any change processes that you are in.
Yeah, I think the empathy. You stole my thunder, Giles. I couldn't see empathy on your word cloud, and I was like, where's empathy? There's some small words in there, but yeah, I think for me, how I kind of think of good communication is actually most importantly, understanding how the other person's feeling. Because in my head, I think we can all change the way in which we deliver the message. What we can't change is the way in which it's landed on the other side, or how the person hears it, or how the person receives it. I know you can in the way in which you change the message, but for me, it's always I'm trying to understand, especially in a difficult conversation, how's that other person feeling, or how's that other person, what signs are they giving me? Are they kind of crossing their arms, and in a protective state? Are they open and accepting? How do they feel? And it's being able to like realize and know how somebody feels without them actually telling you, I think is a really good skill to try and to try and tackle, and then obviously adjusting the way in which you're communicating, or landing that message, or you have the dialogue you're using, to make it land as best as possible with that recipient of that information. But hey, I'm rubbish at all of those things I've just talked about, because I googled it 3 hours ago and made some notes. But I don't know, I wish I was better. And but I guess it's just awareness and self-awareness of how you come across, even in the most tenuous of times as well. I mean, in a program background, God, getting these bloody business cases written and 3 hours before go live, or a cut over, you're all walking around the office at 5 o'clock, it's all mayhem. Those are the critical moments, where you need to use those skills that you've either been taught or learned or have, to communicate with those people. That's my view of what good communication is.
I'll come to you in a second, Toby, but it's really interesting, that point, because just before the pandemic, I'd been sort of doing some research on this, understanding how I communicate with my team. How do I get feedback? How do I provide feedback as well, especially in a tricky scenario where you may be providing feedback that could be considered negative by that person. Well, I was reading an article on HBR about how you engage with someone, and the adversarial way we normally hold those conversations in. I sit one side of the desk, you sit the other side of a desk, and how we engage it's very sort of confrontational. What I was reading is sort of a change in the way you engage with the person you're talking to is sit at a 45-degree or a 90-degree angle to them. So if you've got a table, sit sort of almost to the side of them. So rather than sort of being sort of, okay, this is something quite formal, it then becomes much more of a conversation and a two-way and a discussion. And I just found that it was such a tiny little change. I got so much more engagement from those people I was having those conversations with. It's just such a small thing, and I consider myself fairly open, but it's always difficult to provide feedback that people aren't either 100% happy with, or might be difficult.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I was commenting, I'm laughing because I went out with my partner a couple of days ago, and I hate sitting opposite my partner. It's always like you're in having that conversation. So whenever I'm in trouble, I go beside her and say, let's share the wine, and be like, I'm in trouble. But
do you ever sit opposite her?
I sometimes I do, sometimes, but most of the time it's on the side. I just don't like that. Yeah, but it's an important point, and it's physical meeting space. It's the way in which you listen to somebody, or you understand their position. Totally agree with all that.
What are your thoughts on the communication, either the sort of the comments I've made or anything else?
Yeah, I think the real challenge comes here when you need to communicate to a very large audience, and you don't necessarily have that ability to have those kind of one-to-one conversations. So particularly when you're looking at things like organizational change, or change that's going to impact maybe customers, something like that. You don't always have that opportunity to be that one-on-one. So you have to think about the different channels that you can use to get your message over. You have to be much more articulate over the kind of messages that you're sending out, and think about all the potential implications and how people may perceive those different messages. I think you need to look at lots of different ways of communicating. So it's not necessarily a newsletter or anything like that. There may have to be multiple different levels of communication, and potentially tailored for different groups of people within there as well. So very much bringing up that kind of stakeholder management type thing, identifying your stakeholders, identifying different ways of communicating with them, understanding what is their potential, some of their concerns you may need to address. And likewise, exactly as you're saying, Giles, it's not just around what you're saying to them, is, well, how do you get some feedback coming back? Conversation communication is a two-way thing, isn't it? So again, looking for different ways, different options to get that kind of feedback coming through. At one level, people are very comfortable giving their feedback through a forum or something like that, but other people aren't. Other people want to have that one-to-one conversation. Maybe they want some form of assurance or something like that. So you really need to think through these different channels and different ways of being able to communicate with people, and being able to respect the way in which they want to communicate and talk to you, and understand what are some of the implications of these changes coming through as well.
Yeah, that comms strategy.
Yeah, it's hugely important, isn't it? And it's always the direction of change as well. Like, lots of organizations will set strategy at the top level and disseminate it down the organization. But actually, how often do people actually ask for that kind of review bottom up? And how often do you ask for kind of feedback and get it from the kind of lower stakeholders to the more senior stakeholders? So yeah, leveling that feedback and doing the 360 reviews, continually getting people understanding. Sharing how they feel. Surveys, is a massive part of that. How many people have delivered a project or a program without doing a survey? I know I've done lots. Probably more without surveys than I have with surveys. And actually, does that just probably thinking out loud, but every project is a change impact, right? Every project we deliver, every minor work activity, every change request is a change impact. Why aren't we doing some level of surveys across every one of them? Communication and change management, to me, is only really done in transformational change projects, these bigger programs. It's never really done on a in my experience anyway, public sector, but on a project by project level when I was involved in it anyway.
I certainly remember back in the day having an argument with one of my program managers, and they were trying to get me to do some IT work or whatever it might be at the time, and their description was, it was just an IT project, get on and do it. And my response back to them is there's no such thing as an IT project. Everything has an element of change with it. Now, there might be 90% of that might be change, or just 1% of that might be some element of change. But this is around change management. We no longer do IT projects. We no longer do just an HR change. You have to consider these change elements within everything that we do. And that is really what the core of a project is. And I think this concept of a project is just something you can give to a project manager and they can run off and do independently, and it's done. That's a crazy notion these days.
Yeah, that independent task. Here is X, please deliver Y, and that's it. There's just a nice, easy waterfall project where you do from the start to the finish. But just touching on one point. So I brought this book up previously about creating psychological safety, and Amy Edmondson, she's an HBR, she's a Harvard Business School professor. It's a really interesting book about how actually to engage staff, especially at a more junior level, and create a culture where people feel able to ask those awkward questions. We've all been in meetings where we've sat there and thought, well, this sounds ridiculous what you're saying, but you don't feel particularly comfortable in asking that awkward question, or asking that question that might draw some response that wasn't expected. So I think as I evolve as sort of a program director, as a project manager and a project professional, I think about how I can then create that space for people to feel comfortable giving me that feedback. And I always ask for it. So I've just started a project with Microsoft, and sort of my initial conversations with them, I want you to be as candid as possible, be respectful throughout the project, but be as candid as possible. Present opportunities, issues as they roll through, rather than thinking, okay, well, I won't say this because the client might find that negative. So yeah, it's a difficult one to do, to give people that space and to feel comfortable doing it. I through earlier parts of my career wouldn't have felt comfortable on lots of occasions giving that feedback. So I think it's something that I'm really working on at the moment. But
I think it's wider, even wider than that. Even the strategy and the landscape of the future of technology change is being talked about now from Microsoft, not just being a tech partner, but being a change partner. And so, we are talking, with a number of different people in the community now to talk about, and Microsoft are actually, seeing this as a success criteria for the future in 5-10 years time, is that there will be no such thing as a technology partner. There will be change partners, and that's an interesting concept to be in an operating environment and go out to market to only get change. Who knows? We'll see what the future
So to help us with this, I will move on to Toby, and Toby is going to sort of talk us through a bit of a change management framework, talking about preparing for change, doing the change, and embedding the change. So I'll hand over to Toby. We'll go through this conversation again. If you've got any points you want to raise, chuck it in the chat, or put your hand up and ask Toby a direct question if there's something that's on your mind.
There is a chat request for you, Giles. I think.
Oh, is there? So I can't see because I'm presenting. So let me come off the presentation mode. So
I think it's just to remind us.
Okay, I'll chuck it in the chat, and Toby, you crack on.
Great stuff. So I was just going to give a bit of an overview as to one way of doing change. I think the really key thing to say here is there is not a one size fits all towards change management. So there's multiple different approaches. That there are certainly the wrong way of doing it, but it doesn't mean that there is just one single right way of implementing change. I think it will completely vary on the type of change that's been implemented, on where that change has been implemented, what kind of people, what are the impacts of that change, how used to change people are. There's so many variables that fit into this. So this absolutely isn't a one size fits all, but within here there are a number of different tools and techniques that can be used to help manage that change process. Now, I guess in part, we've kind of answered the exam question that we started with today, which is, is change management all about communication? The answer to that probably is no, it's not all about communication. Communication is absolutely key to change management, and let's make sure we keep that in mind. But I think there are a number of other things as well that need to be done to assist a successful change. Now, what I was going to talk about today is essentially a change framework that's really built around some work that was done in academia, I think back in the 50s. For those of you who are familiar with a guy called Kurt Lemwin, he's very much seen as the father of change management. Lots of other people have built on his work, so particularly people like John Cotton, people like that over time. But essentially the basis of this change management framework is around 3 steps. It sounds very simple when you start talking it through. It's around preparing for change, i.e. you don't just jump into it and start doing it straight away. Actually, you need to, guess what, plan it a little bit, prepare the people, prepare the business, whatever needs to be done. Second step then is you need to do it. But again, that can be quite a slow process. That can be iterative. There's a number of things that need to be done as you are actioning that change through. And then probably one of the most wise, it's all important, but a key bit to this then is once you've completed that change, you don't just walk away and hope that the world is going to sort itself out. You actually need to embed that change. So going back to Lemwin, I mean, he referred to this as unfreezing. So you're creating the conditions for change, implementing change, and then what he termed freezing or refreezing again. So you're establishing a new norm. So these were the kind of the 3 steps that were generally advised. So let's talk a little bit around kind of preparing for change and what does that mean? And Giles, Joe, jump in here if you think there's any areas we can talk about in a bit more detail. But predominantly the first thing is really defining the change you're going to do. So have you got a clear, articulated set of statements as to what is the end state? What are you intending to change? Have you got that in such a state that actually you could communicate that to anybody in your organization or any of your customers, whoever's going to be impacted by this change, and it's something that everybody can understand and relate to? Okay, so you don't need to have a deep business case with loads of complexity behind it or financial indicators or anything like that. You need to have a very clear set of statements. Now, sometimes, and I work in an IT background, sometimes in IT it's very simple. So we have things like burning platforms, for example. So we know that a system isn't going to be supported anymore and we need to move. Or we might have some kind of disruptive technology coming through. It's going to affect our business and change the way in which we interact with our customers. So we know we need to move into online marketing, for example, because that's what everybody else is doing. So if we're going to survive, that's what we need to do. But the majority of the time, I think change these days is a lot more subtle, it's a lot more complex. So trying to bring out these kind of key messages that everybody can understand is very difficult. But they do need to be articulated to make sure that everybody can buy in and understand what that change is about. And ultimately, that really forms the basis of that first bit of communication, which you can issue out to everybody who's then impacted by the change. In terms of then preparing for those change, I think you need to define things like the scope. So what is the end state? What is the world going to look like once this change has taken place? Need to ensure that the benefits are clearly articulated as well, because if you haven't got benefits for doing change, well, there's no point in doing it. So you need to be clear around, from a business perspective, what you're actually going to do. And needs to be very clear around kind of how you're going to run this. So very much into the project management world. What's the race? Who's responsible for doing what? What's the timescales? All those kind of important things. But really trying to come back to this single compelling statement as to why you're doing that, and to generate a sense of urgency. To really ensure that you gather some momentum for this change is absolutely key. Time again, we've seen the need for some change coming along, but everybody says, oh, well, it's not that important, we do that next month, or we don't need to worry about that too much. You need to gather this sense of urgency, or this burning platform, or this disruptive technology, whatever that might be, to ensure that you can actually move things forward. So once you've got to a point where you've got the reason for doing it, it's then getting the correct people involved. So you need to have, and it's very obvious, but you need to have senior sponsorship to this. You need to have a captain who can stand at the front and to give that sense of direction. But it's got to be more than just a figurehead. That person has got to be bought into it. I'm sure we've all been in situations where we've heard our CEO or something saying, "Yep, this is the most important thing for our company," and then they never mention it ever again. So you kind of think, well, is it really that important? Plenty of times we've heard politicians telling us how important something is and how we've all got to change, and then we never hear of anything else ever again, do we? So you've got to have that real buy-in, and those leaders have got to manage this and be very visible throughout the entire change process. I think that's probably something which we're seeing a lot more in government these days, Giles. Definitely seeing a lot more SROs, certainly from my experience working in central government anyway, a lot more SROs being a lot more actively involved in their programs, and actually taking kind of leadership through.
Absolutely. I think even we've actually recently had a change in government. So I think before, SROs were seen as a part-time job, or a role that you maybe cycle through. You're not fully involved in that program. You provide some guidance, but they weren't given the time and space to really work on those programs and projects. So the initiatives, I think it's really a really important point to raise, that giving those people the length of time within that program to really see it through, and then the accountability for that initiative being delivered, I think is really important, rather than being there for 18 months, seeing part of the program, which you might be able to cover some of the failings, might trundle along. You build up problems, that new person has to come in, they change their way of working, etc., etc. So I agree.
It's really like kind of challenging from an SRO perspective, being involved in that, and even the partner organizations and not even the central gov. I remember conversations going around, it was like hot potato, who's going to be SRO of this project, and then we were like chucking it around going, I don't want it, well, it's actually, an SRO should be someone who's championing it, who came up with the idea in the first place. I remember those meetings like they were yesterday. They were but yeah, it's good, definitely there was a lack of investment and training in those SROs, and making sure that they are the captain, and they believe in it is the most important thing as well.
That's another big part that the government has addressed in the past couple of years, is they have developed, this comes back to training and development of a senior staff. They've developed a program with Oxford University, which is called the Major Projects Leadership Academy. So all program directors and SROs now are required to take part in that program, which is an 18-month sort of master's level program, to develop your skills. Because I think, again, you can go through your career without actually developing the right skills. You can be there going through your life cycle, and then you get given a project or a program or initiative that you have to be an SRO for, Toby, and you'll have seen this, is that person may not be the right person for that piece of work. So giving the right people the right training, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole other topic, the right training for roles.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I've seen more recently is some of these change leaders come in who aren't necessarily within that function or within that department. So almost coming in as a kind of external facilitator to lead through some of that change. And sometimes because they've not necessarily been invested in the old ways of working, and they've not necessarily been tied to some of those, directly tied to some of those people who are delivering this change, that tends to bring a slightly different perspective, I think, to their role as well. So again, that's worked very well in some organizations. In others, that creates a bit of resistance because they think, well, who's this outsider coming in? They don't know what they're doing here. But that, I think, can be very positive as well.
The people want to.
Absolutely. It's a good comment in here. I'm reading it as well. I can see Giles is reading it.
Yeah, but again, before decisions are made, but that comes back to what we've said sort of several times throughout this, is engaging with people and understanding those people who are affected by the change and explaining or providing that journey and understanding how it affects those people, rather than a top-down approach to say, okay, here's an initiative, we need to go and do it. This is a change being done to you rather than the change being done with you. It may affect you, and it may affect you negatively. However, if you can get that engagement, and that person then understands how it's going to change their role, their responsibilities, where they're going to go, where they may move to, that they're going to, if their role is changing or adapting, is then helping them through that process and ensuring that they go to a place either that they want to be in, or you assist them in finding a role that does suit them. So
even many times when you recognize it's a transformational requirement or a change journey, it is a challenge to get people to feel a part of the change and like they're informing it. And I think that no matter how good you are at top-down change, if it's a lot easier to make people feel a part of the journey and to get their feedback. These transformation is everywhere at the moment. This word is transformation, is buzzword at the moment. And every department we're talking to and every company we're talking to at the moment is going through transformational change journey. And I'm often kind of talking to people and trying to get them to articulate the transformational change objectives, and they're always saying, oh, the board, the change board, the transformation board want to do this and this. And actually that comment there is just made me think, how often do they go out to the audience and say, we think we want to change, we think we want to transform, but how could we transform? You tell us. And it comes back to that survey earlier on. I doubt in many of those occasions they are doing that, from my experience anyway.
And I say the other way to look at it, rather than it being this SRO more visible or something being done to them, is creating a structure that you are able to show the visibility of where that person fits into that change process. So I'm just going to put in another book. Sorry, I'm doing my MBA at the moment, so I read too much. But it's about OKRs. How do we provide transparency? How do you show where you're playing a part in the transformation or the change, or your part in the business, creating that transparency so someone knows where they are involved in that process, and you measure it, and you can say, here, if you do this, it rolls up into this objective and this objective and this objective. So it makes a huge amount of difference when people are removed from their being treated like a mushroom, to actually being enlightened and knowing where the business is going and how they're affecting that change.
I think the other component of that as well is not just relying on change being driven from a top down. Part of bringing a change together is you've got to kind of build coalitions. Back in the old days, we used to call them things like business champions or change champions or whatever it is. But it's taking people who are down on the ground at multiple different levels. So and engaging them, and it's you want to get willing volunteers into this. You can't press gang people into making change. It's got to be people who believe in it and want to be part of this. And those people will essentially evangelize, and they will take that message out, and they can be part of your kind of volunteer army who will lead that change message and essentially becomes our allies throughout this entire process. And very often they're very powerful when you get to your naysayers, the people that I don't want to do change, I don't want to do this. Once they see their own peers are taking on this change or even leading that change through, then typically they will drop their barriers, and they will join that volunteer army as well.
Yeah,
okay, so
absolutely. Sorry, Toby, I don't know whether it's me or you, but or Giles, I'm not sure, but I had a bad network quality warning then, so apologies if it disrupted for anybody else, but I think it was okay on the wider audience. But yeah, that sounds great. I think you've got another section out, Toby, haven't you? Embed the change, or is there a bit before then?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's plenty more techniques. The only one I was really going to talk about very quickly was something called force field analysis, which again is something that's come from Lenwin. So this was very much around preparing for the change, and the concept behind this was looking at those identifying those factors that are going to support the change through, and looking at those factors which are going to resist change. So being able to identify those within your organization, identifying who are the stakeholders that are aligned to each one of those, and then for those actions that support the change, what can you actually do to encourage that a little bit more? And for those factors which are resisting change, essentially these are now your barriers for change. What are the strategies that you need to employ to start to remove those as well? And one of the things that Lemon suggested was you actually rate all of these as well. So you give them a score between kind of 1 and 5, 5 being very high, 1 being low, and you can add these all up. So you get a total value for your supporting change and a total value for your resisting change. So if your resisting change is actually higher than your supporting change, well, then you've got a problem, and you definitely got some work to be done. But it is around identifying these key barriers for change, and making sure that as a change management team, you've got the ability to remove some of these obstacles to enable some of these other change management components to take place. And that to me is always absolutely critical.
Yeah, couldn't agree with that more. Maybe later on, could we send out some collateral on that study, on that analysis for evaluating that change? Maybe we could dig something out. Toby, send it out later.
Yeah.
That's a good little model to use. And yeah, the other comment in here now, we have the problem where managers get twitchy that those lower than them in grade might know something before them. I don't know why. I love people like in the lower realms knowing more than me. And it makes my life easier if but yeah, I totally agree. In government there is that hierarchy, that the grade concept. It happens in private sector as well, we know that, but the idea for me is that we could promote people at lower grades, but knowing more than those at senior grades, then ultimately we'll get a better outcome for us all, and that they should steer the ship, but it's just the captain at the top actually turning the wheel.
That's we've over the past few years I've seen, and I do this, and actually I had a reverse mentoring call the other day where the person really really went to town on me, which was once quite scary, but also really good because it gave me some real clarity, and that it was so good to have so the reverse mentoring is a junior member of staff will mentor me, so they will tell me where I'll talk to them about what's going on, what is happening in my life and in my work, and they will then provide feedback on what it's seen like from a junior level. It's great. I think it's fantastic, and if, as Giles says, it takes time, but if we can champion that, it becomes a norm after a while. People start to engage with those junior staff. So Joel will be doing with all of his staff. They then move on, they can champion it elsewhere, etc., etc. It does take time, but that sort of government culture of hierarchy is quite well embedded. So we have got 15 minutes left. I just want to move on to the final slide, and I'm just going to see if it worked. Yeah, here we go. Okay, I don't know. This is the first time I've done a poll, so I'm launching it right now. If you can let me know whether it's worked.
Did we say we wanted a poll in our change management approach? Oh,
no,
God.
We didn't. I just directed it from the top.
That's audience members. We didn't say.
What is the area that's done least well during change in your experience? And this I will, Joel, if you can keep an eye on the results, or Toby, and just give me a heads up, because I'm going to present the final slide, which covers off on these areas that I put into the poll. And if you can tell me whether the poll's actually worked, that would be great.
Yeah, it's worked. Yeah, it's come up.
Excellent.
What is the area that is done least well during your change experience? Okay.
So I'll just go through some of these areas. So we were sort of, the final part of this was, and thank you, Toby, for that sort of that excellent sort of and really engaging piece. The final part was just about other areas within business change, and I sort of, Toby's stolen a lot of this, sort of the thunder and a lot of this, and explained a lot of it anyway, especially sort of that establishing the vision, giving clear foundation for your future success, really so showing what we're trying to achieve. We've talked about engaging stakeholders. So how do we actively engage people? How do we get that feedback from those people who are the change is going to impact, but also those who want to drive that work? Toby's given us some excellent information on how to plan for that change, so how to really structure your change in that framework. We've talked a lot about communication and some of those skills, the active listening, the understanding how we can listen to our employees or listen to people within the organization, engage with them about understanding where the change is required, what ideas they have. An area that we've sort of, Toby touched on very lightly, that resistance and risk. I think the risk is really important within a change program. And understanding where that resistance is coming from. But it's taking that resistance, understanding where that resistance comes from, and then addressing what the concerns are and what the issues are, why there is resistance to that. So what is the underlying problem? What is the underlying resistance? And how do we go about addressing that? And I think sort of an area that potentially hasn't been discussed is within your change process, having it so it's not, okay, we start here and we end here, and that's in 5 years time or 3 years time or however long. Actually celebrating success along the way, which goes also into sort of the final point about that iterative process. So you want to be course correcting as you go through the development of your change initiative, but celebrating success as you move through that, I find, is a really good way of engaging those people that are delivering the change, but also those people that the change is happening to. Success that we've hit the milestone, the part of it's gone really well, or areas that haven't gone well but we adjusted to, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really important to really champion that success, because it brings those people who are delivering the program, because it can be quite difficult, but also it brings those people along in that process who are being impacted by that change. So Joel, Toby, have you got anything you want to add to that, or whether or not there's anything that's fallen out of that poll? Because I can't see the poll.
No, okay, so the results from the poll are if there's eight responses, and for the first time ever there's like a flat line on the responses, which is that doesn't really answer the question for you. So if somebody hasn't done the poll, if you could do the poll to make one the kind of the winner, that would be great.
Really?
Because there's 25% for 4 values, so
amazing.
And then 0% for 2 values. So we know what it doesn't, what the community and what the audience doesn't think it is, which is they don't think it's plans for changes, and they don't think it's resistance and risk, but they think 2 of each people who voted think it's equally everything else. So it doesn't give you the.
Well, it's good thing we're doing the whole of change the whole of change is a problem.
Yes, so. very, very badly. Which is actually a really interesting point. And actually, someone's just voted, and whoever voted made it push up the established division has gone to the top scoring one, with celebrate success being the bottom, voted one.
It's interesting. That vision one is really interesting, because I have seen many times, and I've even been part of projects that define a vision that really is just a woolly example of what you're trying to achieve. So it is a really good point that establishing a strong vision of where you want to go, what you're trying to achieve. It's so important for that project to gain buy-in.
But okay, my view out of those, establishing the vision is the hardest one to do. You know, it could easily be communicated and understand. I mean, I struggle in my position. I mean, we all struggle to predict the future and to create a vision for the future, and then to be able to articulate that for everybody.
I suppose in government as well, because of the scale of the projects, it's also quite difficult, as you say, with the rate of technology change. How can you provide a compelling vision for, say, 5 years' time of what we're trying to achieve? It's a really difficult one. And how do you, unless you create a vision and a strategy that you're able to iterate and change as you go through, and then your culture where people accept that the fact that things will change as technology changes, situation changes, it's hard to create something that really gets buy-in for a long period of time.
Yeah, and then the difficult challenges, aren't there, in terms of, you know, creating a vision for something that you don't ultimately have control over is a totally different challenge to creating a vision as a CEO of a privately owned business, you know, where you know, it's just total different scales, isn't it?
I mean, I think this opens up an interesting area, doesn't it? As to whether organisations are in perpetual change, or whether the scale of that change needs to be brought into something much smaller so it can be achieved in that smaller time frame. And maybe that's a different way of looking at change, rather than looking at it as, you know, here's something that needs to be done and it's this big, we do it and then we move on. I suspect it's going to move much more towards that perpetual change thing. And you know, the change is happening much quicker and much more often anyway, isn't it? So perhaps it's more around how we prepare people to you know, to live and breathe change all the time and to accept that, rather than being more of a fixed element.
And I think one of my points earlier on, which was I didn't get to, but you know, to do that is to make change fun. So just one of my kind of key points I wrote down on my OneNotes is just because change is going to be here forever, so let's make it fun, let's make it enjoyable, let's play with it, let's enjoy it, let's embrace it, you know, but also let's deal with it up front as well, because some of the projects that I've worked on in my experience are, you know, changes at the back end of the process, whereas, you know, I think from today we've all been really clear, and there's been other inputs and other views that change needs to be, you know, approached at the same point in which the project is initiated, if not before. If we can get to that point as well, that'd be brilliant. But also there's a concept of change governance as well, so governing the amount of change, rather than project governance, rather than, you know, portfolio boards looking at projects. Why isn't portfolio boards in the future looking at change?
Toby, I love your point. I think that's a really good point to raise about changing our perception of change. Identifying it as a process that's continual, rather than calling it out as saying this is a change initiative, saying this is a project for change, actually embedding that culture within your workspace and your organization to say change is part of everything we do, and sort of innovation, entrepreneurship, changing the way we address it, looking at a way to create that culture of innovation, which is that change. But it's seen as a positive. Innovation is seen as a positive rather than change is seen as a negative, in sort of my experience. I think that's a really good way that really good advice to anyone looking at delivering any kind of initiative, is say changing the way we use our language to address what you're trying to achieve. So it's innovation or entrepreneurship. I think that's a great point. Really, really bought into that.
Yeah, one of the things that I find perverse, I do see it in a number of big organisations, is the way that they do have a